Hey, what's up YouTube? Dan the Fix-It Man. Got another quick video here for you. I'm going to show you how to change your front brake pads on a 2014 Honda Odyssey. The first thing I like to do is push the caliper pistons back in so that we have a little bit more room in here for the new pads. But before you do that, it's a good idea to pop the hood and take a look at the master cylinder reservoir just to make sure that you're not going to overflow the fluid if you push it backwards through the system. The other method that you can do is just pop this cap and open this bleeder screw, put a little piece of hose or tubing on there. As you press the caliper pistons back in, that will expel the old fluid, and then you could just top off the master cylinder when you're done. I usually don't open that up unless we are changing the brake fluid, so in this case I'm just going to take a quick look at the master cylinder and make sure that we've got enough room. Now here's our brake master cylinder under the hood, and you can see that I've actually, if I just kind of wipe this dust off of here, our fluid is all the way back down here. It's even below this line here in the front. It does look kind of dirty, but I'm not going to be changing it on this vehicle today. If your fluid level were high, you could take this lid off and suck out some of that brake fluid to make room for the new pad material. Or again, you can open the bleeder screw and push it out that way. Either way, you do not have to take this off if you're pushing the caliper pistons back in. The air that's trapped inside here will be able to escape. These are sealed, but it does allow air to escape under pressure. If you have a hard time telling where the level is, you can always just take the lid off and take a look inside. So these two little slots right here are pretty handy if you just get a flathead screwdriver. Pry in here. What you're doing is pulling against the body of the caliper and against the rotor, and that's pushing these pistons back inside. You just steady pressure, kind of alternate between the two. By the way, it helps if you have your wheel turned in the direction of the pads that you're working on. In this case, I'm on the passenger side, so I've got the wheel turned to the right. And once you get that moved a little bit, you can move your screwdriver over here in between the pad and the rotor. Now on some vehicles, this is enough to push the caliper pistons back in. Other times you still need to push the caliper pistons back in with another tool similar to this, or like a C-clamp. But now we can go ahead and take off these caliper slide pin bolts. These are a 14 millimeter. If you're just using a wrench or socket, you may have to hold this slide pin steady with a 19 millimeter open end wrench. I'm just going to use this little impact. This is the 2960 Milwaukee with a 14 millimeter socket. That's what those guys look like. Set those aside. These little caliper hooks are pretty handy. Just take off the caliper, and I'm going to put that up here, up and out of the way, hanging from the coil spring. That way we're not hanging it from the brake line here. And you can see our brake pads are pretty much gone. Taking out these little V springs first. These are designed to push outward so that the pads don't drag on the rotor all the time. Then we can pop out our old brake pads. Same with this one here. And you can see what was making some noise right there. If you can see, that's kind of shiny. Actually looks like this is just barely hanging on there. See how it's riveted to the back, and it's created so much friction from wearing that it's starting to come loose. But because that's nice and shiny, you know that it's been scratching on the rotor, and that's that little squealing noise that you're hearing right before you get to the actual backing plate. But we're right there, so this is completely worn down. But we didn't make it to the rotor, so we're not going to change the rotor. They do look like they're a little glazed and whatnot, and sometimes you can just hit that with some brake clean it up. Even some sandpaper might help take off some of that glazing. Right now we're not going to bother with taking that off and having that turned or machined. Some old sandpaper or emery cloth on here does help take off some of the glaze. This is nowhere near the same as machining this, but it seems to take off some of the glazing and helps those new pads bed in a little bit better. That didn't do much, but it did take off a little bit of that mirror glaze. We'll just kind of wipe that down with some brake cleaner. Now these are the replacement brake pads we got. They're engineered for OE performance. They look good, but they did not come with any replacement hardware. So when you don't replace these, you know, these are a wear item, and sometimes some buildup gets in between this caliper bracket and this little shim or a retainer clip. So it's not a bad idea to take those off and clean them. Just brush them with a wire wheel or a wire brush here, especially the surface where the pad sits. Again, a lot of kits come with replacement hardware here, and so we wouldn't have to worry about this. You can see where it's kind of worn right there where the pad's been riding on that, but we will clean this up a little bit with the brush and then put them back in. I'm also going to clean this off the same way, but we're going to put just a little bit of grease on the edges of the pads, which will eliminate some of that wear. Just clean this up here too. When you put these back in, they have a tendency to hang up here in the middle. Pry a little screwdriver in there. That seems like the trick to get them to seat. Just make sure that nothing is sticking out and going to scratch and make noise on the rotor. That's good enough for what we need. Again, you can see a little bit of wear or build up right there, but this is going to work. Now we're also going to pull out and re-grease the slide pins here. It helps if you just pull back on the boot when you slide these out, and we'll wipe off the old grease. Sometimes it helps to put it back in once or twice to pull out additional grease, additional old dirty grease. And if you use the wrong type of grease, this little rubber piece here will swell up and cause these slide pins to get stuck. So I recommend using something like this, like Sil Glide. It's great for brakes because it's like a silicone based type of grease. It just takes a little dab like that. Just kind of smush that around on the slide pin and then put it right back in. Sometimes you have to pull back on that boot again to burp out any of the air. Do the same thing with this upper slide pin. You can see how it's really dirty. These get real dirty, you know, dust and whatnot gets in there. These do get hot, and then they'll start to pit, and it just won't slide freely, and that'll cause your brakes to bind up or hang up and drag on the rotor. So same thing, just a little bit of that grease. I'm just using the clean part of my glove here. Just make sure that those spin nice and free. On the new brake pads, I like to put some more of this grease on the back of the shim here. Just kind of spread that out where the two pistons are going to make contact, and then a little bit at each end, and that's where it rides inside these little channels, and it helps to put a little dab of grease on there too. Just make sure you don't get any grease on the surface of the rotor or on the pad material here or the face of the pad. If you do, just clean it off. I'll just slide that in place. Kind of helps if you kind of put it in at an angle. Same with the outside pad here. Just being careful because I've got some of this grease on these gloves. Just a thin layer is really all you need. Don't get too carried away with this stuff, because you just don't want that leaking or oozing out on the surface of the pad. Now I'm not going to put these V-springs in just yet because I'm not ready to put the caliper back on. It looks like these are not pushed in far enough to be able to fit over the pads. Again, sometimes that trick works with the screwdriver, sometimes it doesn't, depends on the vehicle. So I'm just going to use this tool here. So just grab an old brake pad and this little tool here. I'll get a link in the description if you don't have this. It's pretty handy. I mean, it does work just like a C-clamp, of course, and it pushes the pistons back inside the caliper. Just like that. You know, it's a good idea to alternate, I guess, in between each one here as you're pushing this. And that'll do it. Just gonna balance that up here, trying not to bend the backing plate while I put these guys in. So these are just the little V-springs that push outward on the pads so that they don't drag on the rotor. But when you do this, sometimes it helps to have one hand over the pads, or else they'll push out. Now these are not pushing out completely. This is kind of a tight pad, possibly because we didn't replace these here. All right, so next time what I'm going to do is recommend that they get pads that come with hardware, or order the hardware separately just the next time that they change the brake pads, because this is just a little too snug for my liking, and the spring is not even able to push it out. I'm gonna see if I can free that up. Again, we do have some Sil Glide grease on the ends, and hopefully that will loosen that up. All right, That feels a little bit better. That feels a little better. So they aren't going to drag on the rotor completely. They're not as free moving as I'd like, but they're definitely not going to get stuck. But that's something you just kind of got to be mindful of, you know, and that's, I think, partly a reason to, that would be one argument to change these, or maybe do a little bit better job cleaning them than I did, but I think that'll work. That feels a lot better, so now I can feel it pushing out a little bit with those springs. So let's hold that steady, and then we're gonna bring this around and just be careful to not damage those boots. And then here also you need to pull in on the slide pins just a little bit to line these up. Get these started. I'm just going to snug these for now. And then the torque spec on these here is 37 foot-pounds. So I'm just using my torque wrench here. That's the gear wrench 85062. Sometimes when you grease up these slide pins, they're going to want to spin on you when you're trying to tighten them. So I'm grabbing a 19mm open end wrench just to hold that steady while we torque these. And that's pretty much everything. A couple things: we didn't turn the rotor, we didn't replace the rotors. If you do need to replace the rotors, there's just 2 more bolts that hold this caliper bracket on. It's also held in place by this screw here. It's a JI3, Japanese, or JIS 3, I think, Japanese industry standard. That's when this guy would come in handy. That's a little impact screwdriver that basically will take that out, or it's a P3, I guess is the name of it. That's what you need to pull those out. A lot of times they'll strip out. So if you are changing the rotor, just be mindful of that. And you might need to give it a few whacks as well, just with a hammer, just to loosen that up. But that's pretty much it. Just remember, before you head on down the road, go ahead and step on the brake pedal a few times. Now don't press it all the way to the floor. That's not good for your master cylinder. That can damage the seals. Just press it a few times until it feels firm, and that will push these caliper pistons back out, pushing these brake pads up against the rotor where they need to be. Don't forget to top off your master cylinder with the appropriate level of fluid as well, and check your manual for the torque specs and everything. 37 foot-pounds is just what I found online for those 2 caliper slide pin bolts. I hope you liked the video. Please give it a thumbs up if you don't mind. That does help me out. I will get a link in the description to some of the parts and tools used in the video as well. Thanks so much for watching, and good luck.